Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might surprise you. The real life of a medieval princess wasn't actually a fairy tale. Picture this. You're born into silk and stone, surrounded by people who smile while plotting your future, and from the moment the midwife cuts your umbilical cord, your entire existence has already been decided by men you've never met. You're not a person, you're a pawn, a bargaining chip, a walking, breathing contract between kingdoms. The gilded cage is the perfect metaphor for what you're about to understand. Yes, you have the finest things. Tapestries that took years to weave, jewels that caught the light like frozen tears, servants who attended to your every physical need. But freedom, that's the one thing gold can't buy. From childhood, you learn that your body, your choices, and your very thoughts belong to the crown. You exist to produce heirs, to cement alliances, to make peace between warring nations through the sheer fact of your marriage. Historians still argue whether medieval princesses had any agency at all, or if they were simply ornamental prisoners in their own lives. What we do know is this: you'd wake up each morning knowing that your father, or your uncle, or your guardian, had already chosen your husband. You'd never met him. You'd never been asked if you wanted to. Your opinion on the matter was as irrelevant as a portrait's preference for its frame. One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is that many princesses were betrothed before they could even walk. Some marriages were arranged when the bride was literally 3 years old. The consummation, of course, waited until she was older, but the psychological weight of knowing your future was sealed before you understood what a future even was. That's a burden no child should bear. There's a quirky tidbit most people don't realizing: royal women were sometimes written into political treaties like they were land or livestock. A princess didn't just represent herself, she represented the entire political and economic alliance her marriage would create. If the marriage failed to produce a male heir, she could be blamed for failing at her biological purpose. Never mind that male fertility issues were equally likely. The pressure was astronomical and completely one-sided. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from right now. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's fascinating to know where my sleepy friends are scattered across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because what happens next? What you're about to learn about the life of a medieval princess will make you grateful for every single choice you get to make in your own life. You're about to step into those embroidered slippers, walk those cold stone corridors, and experience the suffocating reality of being born into luxury while imprisoned by duty. Your childhood was not playtime. While peasant children ran through muddy fields chasing chickens and laughing at nothing, you were being systematically transformed into a diplomatic asset. From your earliest memories, you were surrounded by tutors. Women whose sole purpose was to sand down your rough edges and polish you into something marketable. And by marketable, I mean marriageable. Needlework was your first language. Before you could read Latin or French, your tiny fingers were bleeding onto embroidery hoops, learning stitches that would take years to master. Every perfectly placed thread was a declaration: I am patient. I am obedient. I can sit still for hours without complaint. The irony: the needlework itself was often taught to keep you quiet and occupied. A medieval version of being handed an iPad to stay out of trouble, except the iPad was a piece of linen and a needle that frequently pricked your fingers until they bled. Historians still debate the extent of literacy education for medieval princesses, but what we know is this: it varied wildly depending on your father's wealth and whim. Some girls learned to read and write multiple languages: French, Latin, possibly Italian or Spanish. Others learned just enough to sign documents or read devotional texts aloud to the household. You were being groomed to be an educated companion to a powerful man, which meant you needed enough intellect to hold a conversation, but not so much that you developed dangerous ideas about your own autonomy. Here's a fascinating quirk of medieval education: you were often taught languages through religious texts. Your first introduction to French might come from a Latin psalter, and your Latin lessons were wrapped up in Bible stories. Learning and piety were deliberately intertwined so that even your intellectual development carried the weight of spiritual duty. The message was clear: your mind, like your body, exists in service to God and the crown. Music and dancing came next, accomplishments that displayed grace and cultural refinement. You learned to move across a room as though floating, to hold yourself with the kind of languid elegance that suggested you'd never done a day of labor in your life. Which was true, technically, but the learning was labor. Exhausting, repetitive, sometimes painful work disguised as leisurely feminine accomplishment. Your hands had to be soft and pale, suggesting you'd never done manual work, even though training them to be that soft and pale required endless hours of maintenance. Physical survival skills were woven in quietly, almost hidden. You learned which herbs could ease a fever, how to inspect food and wine for poison, how to read the mood of a room and disappear into the shadows if danger approached. Some princesses learned to ride horses excellently, not because it was fun, but because you might need to flee quickly if your castle was attacked or your husband decided to go hunting for days. Some learned basic self-defense, though this was whispered about rather than openly discussed. You were being trained as a survival unit, a reproductive vessel, and a political ambassador all at once. And much of this training was so subtle you might not have even realized it was happening. By the time you reached your early teens, you'd been shaped and molded into something your father could be proud of, something he could offer up to a foreign prince as proof of his good breeding and refined court. You were fluent in at least 2 languages, you could navigate complex social situations without making embarrassing mistakes. Your needlework was exquisite, and you'd absorbed the core lesson of your existence: your value lies entirely in what you can provide to others. The woman you might have become if left to your own devices. That person was systematically dismantled before she ever had a chance to exist. And then came the messenger. You remember the day, the dust on the road, the horses being brought to the stables, your father's suddenly serious face at dinner. Someone important had arrived. Someone was discussing you, your body, your future, as though you weren't sitting right there across the table. The conversations happened in Latin, partly so you wouldn't fully understand, though you'd picked up enough over the years to catch the terrible gist of it. An arranged marriage isn't a love story. It's a contract negotiated between 2 families, and you're the collateral, your husband. Whoever he is, wherever he's from, however old or kind or cruel, was chosen because his family's lands bordered your family's lands, or his kingdom was an ally you needed, or his wealth could save your father from bankruptcy. Love isn't even a consideration. In fact, emotional attachment between spouses was often viewed with mild suspicion by medieval nobility. A marriage based on passion might lead to poor political decisions. A marriage based on cold duty, that was reliable, that was sensible, was how kingdoms were built. Here's a mainstream historical fact that might shock you. Many medieval princesses never met their husbands until the wedding day itself. Imagine that. You've spent your entire life preparing for this moment. Your entire identity has been constructed around of being a good wife. And the first time you see the face of the man you're going to spend the rest of your life with is when you're standing in front of a priest wearing a gown so heavy you can barely walk. Some princesses traveled for weeks to reach their husband's kingdom, and during that journey, they had had nothing but time to construct increasingly horrifying fantasies about what awaited them. Historians still argue about the actual age at which consummation typically occurred in medieval marriages, but what we know is this: royal marriages were often used as diplomatic tools before the bride was physically mature. A girl might be married at 8 or 9, but the actual sexual relationship wouldn't begin until she was older, somewhere between 12 and 16, depending on the kingdom, the family, and how desperately they needed an heir. The waiting period was its own special torture, though. Years of knowing your purpose, years of living with a stranger in a foreign court, years of waiting to fulfill the one thing your entire existence had been constructed to achieve. There's something darkly fascinating about how medieval marriage negotiations worked. Your father wouldn't just be trading you away without compensation. He'd be receiving land, money, military support, or political advantage in exchange for you. Sometimes multiple princesses were exchanged between families. It was like a bizarre medieval dating app, except the stakes were kingdoms and nobody involved had swiped yes. A princess might learn that her younger sister was being married off to the same family or to a rival family to keep the peace. You'd go to your husband's kingdom knowing that your value had been precisely calculated and found to equal, say, 300 acres and the promise of military support in case of invasion. The chess game aspect of it all was deliberate and explicit. Medieval rulers understood perfectly well that they were playing a game of strategic advantage, and you were the piece they moved across the board. Sometimes the game worked out. You'd arrive at your husband's court, he'd be kind to you, you'd produce heirs, you'd be treated well, and you might even develop genuine affection for your spouse over time. Other times, the game led to heartbreak, abuse, or political exile, but your personal comfort wasn't the point. The point was the alliance, the land, the power, the continuation of the dynasty. Everything else was irrelevant, including your feelings, your fears, or your hopes for what your life might have been. The wedding night arrives with all the pageantry and terror you've been dreading. You're wearing a gown that cost more than some villages make in a year. Silk imported from the east, embroidered with gold thread, heavy enough that standing in it feels like being buried alive in luxury. Your hair has been braided and looped and pinned to an architectural marvel that took 4 hours to construct. Your ladies in waiting have painted your face with ceruse, a lead-based powder that made you look fashionably pale, even though that same powder was slowly poisoning you. But beauty standards don't care about slow poisoning. They care about the image you project. The ceremony itself is a spectacle. The priest intones Latin. Your father looks satisfied, like he's just closed a very profitable business deal, which technically he has. Your new husband, whom you met for perhaps the first time that morning, says his vows. You say yours, even though your voice is shaking and you can barely feel your lips. Hundreds of people watch. This isn't a private moment, it's a public transaction, and everyone needs to see it happen to confirm that it's binding. Then comes the feast. You sit at the head table while minstrels play and course after course of food arrives. You're not supposed to eat much. That would be unfeminine. But you're expected to look graceful while not eating. Your new husband, who is sometimes kind and sometimes not, sometimes interested in you and sometimes utterly indifferent, sits beside you. Nobles and courtiers lean over to congratulate you, their smiles concealing all manner of calculations and judgments. They're assessing you, comparing you to rumors they've heard about your mother, wondering if you'll be fertile, speculating about how long you'll last in your new position. You feel their eyes like insects crawling across your skin. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that most people don't know after the feast. You'd be escorted to the bedchamber by a massive crowd of witnesses. Yes, witnesses. Your ladies would undress you while the groom's companions undressed him, and they'd literally tuck you both into bed together while everyone watched. This wasn't done out of voyeurism. Well, not primarily. It was done to ensure that the marriage was actually consummated, that no deception was occurring, that you were truly virgins, or at least that you were acting like you were. Medieval nobility needed proof that the wedding night had been successful, and that proof meant eyewitnesses. Historians still argue about whether penetration actually had to occur, or whether witnesses simply had to see the couple in bed together undressed. But the intention was clear and horrifying. Your most intimate moment, the first sexual contact of your life, would have an audience. The shame of that, the violation of it, would stay with you forever. You'd spend your wedding night being judged by strangers who were waiting to hear screams or cries of pain, who were watching to see if you bled onto the sheets because that would prove your virginity. Your body, which had never truly belonged to you, now belonged not just to your husband but to an entire court of observers. After they finally left, and they would leave, eventually, though not before making jokes you found terrifying, you'd be alone with this man for perhaps the first time. And if he was cruel, or rough, or indifferent to your fear, there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. This was your duty. This was your purpose. This was the moment all of your training had been leading toward. And if you cried, if you were hurt, if you were traumatized by the pain and the fear and the sheer violation of it all, nobody would care. Tomorrow, you'd have to smile and act grateful and begin the work of producing in here. Tonight's horror was just the price of being born a princess. Morning comes. Your body aches in ways you didn't know bodies could ache. You're bleeding, whether from trauma or menstruation or both. You're not entirely sure, and you're too ashamed to ask anyone. The sheets are stained. Your ladies come in with their knowing looks and knowing silence, gathering the evidence of your successful. wedding night like holy relics. You dress in a clean gown and try to pretend nothing has changed, even though everything has changed. Welcome to your daily life as a medieval princess, where hygiene is a constant battle against the simple fact that medieval life was filthy. You live in a world where bathing is not a daily activity. In fact, it's relatively rare. Your parents probably bathe maybe 4 times a year, and you're expected to follow similar patterns. The logic was straightforward. Bathing opened your pores and made you vulnerable to illness. Excessive bathing was considered dangerous, particularly for women, whose bodies were thought to be naturally more delicate and susceptible to cold and disease. So you, princess of a great house, would smell. Not metaphorically, literally physically smell, despite all your wealth and status. But you'd work tirelessly against that smell. This is one of the great ironies of medieval princess lifing. You had unlimited resources to stay clean. Yet the prevailing medical wisdom told you that staying clean was dangerous. So you compromised. You didn't bathe frequently, but you used perfumes, oils, and scented waters obsessively. Your ladies would wash your hands and face multiple times a day. You'd use rosewater or lavender water to rinse your mouth. You'd have your hair washed occasionally, maybe once a month, and in between washings, you'd use dry shampoos made from powdered herbs. You'd wear sachets of dried flowers and herbs in your clothes to mask odors. You were, essentially, applying fragrance to cover the inevitable result of not bathing properly. Here's a mainstream historical fact that shocks modern people. Wealthy medieval people used perfume and scent in ways that were almost medically excessive. Perfume wasn't a luxury. It was considered essential to health. The smell of flowers and spices was believed to ward off plague, to cleanse the air of miasma, the bad air that people thought caused disease. So your castle would have smelled like a combination of human bodies, latrines, cooking meat, and an overwhelming amount of floral perfume layered on top, creating a scent profile that was probably worse than either extreme alone. There's a quirky detail about medieval cleanliness that reveals the era's strange logicking. You'd use makeup not just for beauty, but for hygiene purposes. That pale white ceruse powder I mentioned earlier, it was applied partly because pale skin was fashionable, but also because it was thought to have medicinal properties. Your rouge was made from substances like cochineal beetles or red ochre, and it was applied to simulate the rosy flush of health. Your kohl eyeliner was made from substances that were believed to have protective properties. Every layer of cosmetics was part of a system that tried to protect you from the dangers of medieval life while simultaneously poisoning you with lead and arsenic. Your hands received obsessive attention. They had to be soft, pale, and perfectly manicured at all times, a sign that you'd never done manual labor. Your nails had to be carefully maintained, your cuticles pushed back, your hands regularly moisturized with oils made from roses, almonds, or animal fats. This wasn't vanity for its own sake. It was a statement of class and status. A peasant woman's hands were rough and scarred from work. Your hands were supposed to be like porcelain, proof that your life was one of leisure and privilege. The irony, of course, was that maintaining those hands required constant, exhausting work. It was labor designed to conceal labor. You'd spend hours in your bedchamber or in a room dedicated to your grooming, being attended to by your ladies. They'd brush your hair, plait it, unplait it, rebraid it into new configurations. They'd paint your nails with henna or other dyes. They apply your cosmetics carefully, layer by layer. This wasn't pampering. This was work, and it was work that had to be redone constantly because your body kept trying to be natural and no role required you to be anything but. Your bedchamber is your kingdom and your prison combined. If you're lucky, you share it with your husband. If you're unlucky, you share it with several ladies in waiting who sleep on pallets on the floor, ensuring that you're never truly alone. Privacy in a medieval castle is a fantasy. The architecture itself prevents it. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, no doors that lock properly, hallways where servants are constantly moving, always watching, always listening. Your bedchamber is probably the most private space you have, and even there, it's compromised. The bed itself is an architectural marvel. It's enormous, a four-poster affair draped in heavy curtains and hung with velvet or wool to keep in warmth. The mattress is stuffed with straw or feathers, and the whole structure is elevated several feet off the ground because floors are cold and damp. The curtains around the bed aren't just for decoration or privacy, they're functional. Medieval castles are freezing. Your bedchamber probably has a fireplace, but it's inefficient and smoky, and the warmth barely reaches the bed. Those heavy curtains trap what little warmth your body generates, creating a small pocket of relative comfort in an otherwise frigid room. In winter, the temperature inside a castle might only be slightly warmer than outside. You'd sleep under layers of wool blankets and furs, and you'd still be cold. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely unsettling. Medieval beds were often a shared space, not just for married couples, but for entire families. You might sleep in your bed with your husband, your young children, a lady in waiting or two, and possibly a trusted servant. Bodies pressed together for warmth, privacy for sexual relations, virtually non-existent. If you wanted to have marital relations with your husband, you'd do it with an audience of people pretending to sleep while actually listening intently. This was simply normal. There was no expectation of privacy, no shame in this arrangement, because the concept of private domestic space didn't really exist for anyone, regardless of their status. Historians still argue how common this sleeping arrangement actually was at different periods and in different regions, but what we know is that privacy as we understand it today was not a priority in medieval life. The idea that you have a bedroom where only you and your spouse slept, where you could close a door and be entirely alone, that was a luxury that wouldn't become common until much later in history. There's a quirky detail about medieval bedchambers that reveals changing fashion and comfort. As time went on, some princesses managed to acquire locks for their bedchamber doors. Just a lock. Something so basic that modern people wouldn't even think twice about it. But for a medieval princess, getting permission to lock your door at night was a small revolution. It meant that your ladies in waiting had to sleep elsewhere. It meant you and your husband had genuine privacy. Some husbands resented this. They were used to being able to come and go, used to people being available at any time. But some women fought for it, and occasionally won. Your bedchamber would also be the place where received guests, where you did needlework, where you read if you were literate, where you received bad news about family members or political developments. It's not just where you slept. It's a living space, a working space, an audience chamber. You might spend significant portions of your day there, particularly if you were pregnant or ill. The bed itself would become your entire world during pregnancy and the postpartum period. You'd be expected to stay in it for weeks, being tended to by your ladies, the curtains drawn, the room darkened and kept warm. Birth and the recovery from birth would happen in that bed. Children would be born there, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The bedchamber is also where your fertility or lack thereof would be tracked, discussed, and strategized about. Your menstrual cycle would be common knowledge among your ladies in waiting and your husband. They'd monitor you, calculate when you're most likely to conceive, ensure that you're where you're needed for marital relations during your fertile window. Your body, even in the most private space you have, isn't truly private. It belongs to the dynasty. Then comes the moment you've been trained for since childhood, you realize you're pregnant. Your body changes in ways you're not entirely prepared for, even though you've been told what to expect. Your breasts swell and become tender. You're nauseated in the mornings. Your body is betraying you in ways that feel both natural and terrifying. Medieval medicine has no concept of pregnancy tests, so everyone around you is watching for signs. The cessation of your monthly bleeding, the swelling of your belly, changes in your complexion. When it becomes obvious, the entire castle knows. Your pregnancy isn't a private matter. It's a public announcement that you've successfully fulfilled your primary function. Congratulations, by the way. You're now a walking incubator, and everyone's attention is focused entirely on keeping that incubator functional until you produce in here. Medieval medicine understood almost nothing about pregnancy or childbirth, despite centuries of women giving birth. The prevailing theory was that pregnancy was caused by the mingling male and female humors. Essentially, they thought a baby was created by a balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and maintaining that balance during pregnancy was critical. So you'd be subjected to numerous treatments designed to keep your humors balanced. You might be bled deliberately. Yes, they'd literally open a vein and let drain out of your body because they thought it would help. You'd be given herbal concoctions that had no actual medical benefit but made you nauseous. You'd be instructed on what foods to eat and avoid based on medieval humoral theory that had no basis in actual nutrition. Here's a mainstream historical fact that explains a lot about medieval pregnancy. Women were supposed to stay relatively active during pregnancy because strenuous exercise was thought to be dangerous, but complete rest was also thought to be harmful. So you'd be in this strange middle ground where you had to keep moving, stay engaged in light activities like needlework, but not exert yourself too much. You'd be constantly anxious about doing the wrong thing, eating the wrong food, thinking the wrong thoughts. Yes, doctors genuinely believed that if you saw something ugly or shocking while pregnant, it could mark the baby. If you witnessed violence or heard terrible news, it could damage the child in the womb. The stress of trying not to experience stress while carrying a child that could define your entire future was absolutely crushing. Historians still argue about the mortality rates for pregnant medieval women and their infants, but what we know is this: pregnancy was genuinely dangerous. Complications like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, placental abruption, all of these could kill you, and medieval doctors had no way to detect them or manage them. You'd be experiencing symptoms that no one could explain, feeling sensations that terrified you, and the only response available to your physicians was essentially prayer and more useless herbal remedies. There's something particularly dark about medieval pregnancy. You were supposed to accept your pregnancy as God's will, yet simultaneously, you were held personally responsible for the outcome. If you miscarried, it was your fault. You'd done something wrong, eaten something forbidden, thought something sinful. If the baby died, it was your failure as a mother, even though you had virtually no control over what happened. The mother gets blamed, the body is scrutinized, and the actual medical negligence of the era is conveniently ignored. Your diet during pregnancy would be heavily restricted and controlled. You couldn't eat things that were hot or too cold in nature. This was all based on humoral theory, not actual nutritional science. You might be denied foods you were craving because they were unsuitable for pregnant women. Your physicians might prescribe things like eating powdered unicorn horn, or the ashes of the wood of the true cross, or other substances that had value primarily as status symbols and had exactly zero medical benefit. But you'd consume them because they were prescribed by the most educated people available, and refusing might be seen as rejecting God's will or being an uncooperative patient. By the time you reach the later stages of pregnancy, you'd likely be confined to your chambers or at least to the castle grounds. Your belly would be enormous, your body swollen beyond recognition, your feet probably painfully swollen because medieval medicine had no real treatment for edema. You'd be counting down the days until you could finally give birth and have your body back. Except, of course, that wasn't going to happen in the way you hoped. Labor begins, the most terrifying and painful experience of your life. There's no anesthesia. There's no epidural. There's no cesarean section unless you're actively dying, and even then, it would mean almost certain death because they didn't understand infection or sterilization. Medieval childbirth is labor in the trust sense. Hours and hours of intense, unrelenting pain while your body tries to expel a human being. You're alone with your ladies in waiting and perhaps a midwife who has probably attended dozens of births but has no actual medical training. Your husband is nowhere near. Men didn't attend births. That would have been considered inappropriate and emasculating. So you're suffering in a room full of women, and they're doing their best, but their best is essentially holding your hand and praying. The pain is so intense that medieval women sometimes didn't survive the experience, and not always from complications. Sometimes women died from the sheer trauma of labor, from their bodies simply giving up. Infection was rampant. Sepsis from unclean instruments or hands killed countless women in the days or weeks after successful delivery. Hemorrhage killed others. Complications like uterine rupture or placental abruption, things that could be managed with modern medicine, were death sentences. You're lying there in labor, knowing that this could kill you. Everyone in the room knows it too. They're praying harder as the hours stretch on because each hour that passes without successful delivery increases the likelihood that something has gone catastrophically wrong. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely horrifying if the labor went too long, or if the baby was breech. Medieval physicians would sometimes attempt to destroy the baby in the womb to save the mother's life. They'd use hooks or other instruments to dismember the fetus so that it could be removed piece by piece. This was considered a heroic, last resort medical procedure, and it saved the mother's life in the sense that it prevented her from dying of sepsis or hemorrhage. But the psychological and physical trauma of that experience was catastrophic. You'd spend the rest of your life knowing that you'd carried a child, that the delivery had gone wrong, and that your physicians had literally torn your baby apart to extract it. Historians still argue about how common infanticide or deliberate miscarriage was among medieval nobility, but what we know is this: if you couldn't afford to feed another child, if your husband was away at war, if you were already ill, or if you had political reasons to not want to carry a pregnancy to term, there were herbalists and wise women who would help you end a pregnancy. This was dangerous, often fatal, but the desperation sometimes outweighed the risk. An unwanted pregnancy could trap you, could threaten your health, could provide ammunition to your political enemies. Some women chose the risks of an herbal abortion over the certainty of being destroyed by another unwanted birth. But let's assume your labor was successful. After hours of agony, the baby finally comes. There's no immediate rush to cut the cord. That's a modern convention. The cord is left attached for a while, allowing blood to transfer from placenta to baby. Then it's tied off and cut, ideally with something that had been boiled, though boiling as a sterilization method wasn't really understood yet. Your baby is placed on your chest or nearby, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. You've done it. You've survived labor. You've produced a living, breathing child. And if it's a boy, you've secured your position. If it's a girl, your husband and his family's disappointment will be palpable, even if they're polite about it on the surface. There's something deeply tragic about the medieval postpartum experience. You can't feed your own baby. If you're a noble woman, particularly if you're of very high status, you'd employ a wet nurse. Another woman, usually of lower status, whose sole purpose is to breastfeed your child. Your baby would be taken away from you almost immediately and handed to this other woman. You might not see your child for hours or days. The wet nurse would be the person who responded to the baby's cries, who comforted them, who provided nourishment and physical closeness. You'd be expected to rest, to recover, to prepare yourself to be available to your husband again, and to begin thinking about your next pregnancy. The final cruelty is this: after surviving the trauma of pregnancy and labor, after your body has been devastated by the experience, you probably won't have time to recover before you're pregnant again. Many medieval princesses had children every year or every other year, pregnancy after pregnancy. Body destroyed a little bit more with each one, until either they stopped being able to conceive or they died. Now that you've survived childbirth and presumably produced at least one here, you're allowed to think about something other than pregnancy for a few months. But only if you're lucky. Your body is still recovering. You're bleeding heavily for weeks after delivery. Your breasts are engorged with milk that you're not supposed to use yourself. Your belly is soft and saggy, nothing like it was before. Medieval women were expected to stay in bed for at least a week or two after giving birth, confined to their chambers in a darkened room, supposedly to allow their bodies to recover, but also to hide the fact that they're a mess right now. After that confinement period, called lying in, you'd gradually return to your normal duties, except none of your clothes fit anymore because your body has been permanently altered by pregnancy. Which brings us to the matter of your appearance, because now you have a new problem. You need to be fashionable again, and medieval fashion for non-women is absolutely brutal. The gown you're wearing right now is probably restrictive enough to make you feel like you're being strangled. And that's the baseline. Fashion in the medieval period was designed partly as a status symbol and partly, it seems, as a form of torture. Your gowns are made of expensive fabrics: silk, wool, velvet, depending on your status and the season. They're fitted tightly through the bodice and bust, and they're fastened with laces or buttons in the back, which means you physically cannot dress yourself. You need at least one lady in waiting to help you, and getting dressed becomes a complex production that takes 30 minutes to an hour. The bodices of these gowns are often reinforced with bone or wood stays, the medieval predecessor to the corset. These stays don't compress your midsection quite as aggressively as later corsets would, but they do restrict your breathing and your movement. You're supposed to move gracefully, which is difficult when you're essentially being squeezed by your own clothing. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals just how absurd medieval fashion could get during certain periods. Noblewomen wore headdresses that were genuinely enormous and structurally impressive. The hennin, a tall cone-shaped headdress with a long veil trailing behind it, could be over a foot tall. A wimple, a white linen head covering, could be so large and intricately folded that it took significant time and skill to arrange properly. These weren't optional fashion choices, they were required markers of status and dignity. You couldn't be seen in public without an appropriately elaborate headdress. Because your unveiled hair was considered scandalous, a woman with her hair uncovered in public might be mistaken for a woman of ill repute. There's a quirky detail about medieval fashion that's genuinely dangerous. Long trains on dresses could be tripping hazards, which was supposedly fine because it supposedly indicated you had servants to help you manage your clothing. But accidents happened. Women tripped, fell on stairs, caught their dresses in doors or on furniture. Some gowns had sleeves so long that they dragged on the ground, and you'd have to hold them up or have someone carry them for you to avoid getting them dirty. Fashion was a constant performance, and the performance sometimes came with genuine physical risk. Your jewelry would be equally elaborate and heavy. Rings on multiple fingers, necklaces made of precious metals, brooches pinning your clothing or your headdress in place. Belts made of expensive materials, sometimes so heavy that they required servants to help you put them on. All of this weight is being supported by your body, which has recently been devastated by pregnancy and childbirth. Your back probably hurts. Your neck probably hurts. Your feet are squeezed into shoes that are more about display than comfort. But you'll smile and keep moving because this is part of your role. And here's something darker. Your clothing was sometimes used to conceal weapons. Medieval women occasionally wore daggers hidden in their sleeves or beneath their skirts. Some wore small knives on belts. In a world where political violence was common and women had little official recourse for protection, a hidden blade could be the difference between life and death. Your elaborate gowns and sleeves weren't just for show. They could be survival equipment. Your appearance is a constant project. Your hair must be dressed and arranged properly. Your face must be painted with the right amount of cosmetics. Your gowns must be flawless. Any stain, any wrinkle, any deviation from expected standards could be read as neglect or impropriety. You're a walking advertisement for your family's wealth and status, and every thread and jewel is making a statement about your position in the world. Dinner is served, and you're immediately reminded that your food might kill you. Medieval feasts are elaborate productions, but they're also potential death traps. The food has been sitting out for hours, possibly days. It's been handled by servants who may or may not have washed their hands. It's been seasoned heavily with spices, not because the spices taste good, but because they're expensive and they mask the flavor of food that's beginning to spoil. You're eating meat that was salted weeks ago. You're eating pies with fillings that have been sitting in pastry crusts for who knows how long. The bread might be fine, or it might contain mold that could give you ergotism, a condition caused by fungal contamination that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. And somebody has to taste it first. That's the taster. A servant whose literal job is to eat your food before you do to make sure it's not poisoned. The taster is there because medieval noble families poison each other constantly. It's a staple of politics. You're eating food that could be poisoned by a rival faction, by a jilted lover, by a political enemy, by your own husband if he's decided he's tired of you. The taster is the barrier between you and death by arsenic, strychnine, or any of the other poisons that were readily available and relatively easy to administer through food. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's utterly grim. Many medieval poisonings weren't actually successful. The poison was too weak, or the amount was miscalculated, or the victim's system was naturally resistant. So poisoning attempts sometimes resulted not in death, but in severe illness. You might experience violent vomiting, diarrhea, internal bleeding, or neurological symptoms that would persist for weeks or months. The person might recover, or they might die slowly from organ failure. And during all of this, everybody around you would know what had happened. They'd know someone had tried to kill you, and failure would only make your enemies more desperate to try again. There's a quirky detail about medieval feasts that reflects the era's obsession with display. Food wasn't just meant to be eaten, it was meant to be seen. Elaborate dishes would be presented at table before being carved and distributed. A roasted swan with its feathers sewn back on, a pie curated so elaborately it looked like a castle, a aspic gelatin shaped into decorative forms. The presentation was sometimes more important than the actual edibility of the food. You might spend an hour admiring a dish before eating it, and by that time, it's even less safe to consume than when it first arrived. Your drink would be equally suspect. Water from the castle well might be contaminated. Ale and wine would be safer. The fermentation process killed pathogens, but medieval wine was often cheap, poor quality, or adulterated with who knows what. Some wine was deliberately contaminated with drugs or poisons. Some was just awful. You'd drink it anyway because the alternative was thirst, and drinking water carried actual risk of dysentery or cholera. Allergies and intolerances were not understood as medical conditions, they were character flaws. If eating certain foods made you ill, you were supposed to eat them anyway and just tolerate the illness. Medieval physicians might blame it on imbalanced humors and suggest bloodletting, which would make you worse. They wouldn't suggest avoiding the food. Pregnant women with cravings or aversions to specific foods were seen as morally weak or possessed by demons. The answer was always more bloodletting, more prayer, more submission to medical treatments that actively harmed you. Scurvy was common, caused by lack of vitamin C, but nobody understood that. They just knew that some people developed bleeding gums, lost their teeth, and died from infections caused by small wounds that wouldn't heal. Medieval diet was deficient in many nutrients, particularly in winter when fresh vegetables weren't available. You'd spend the cold months eating preserved foods, salted meat, and bread, and developing nutritional deficiencies that would manifest as weakness, hair loss, or infections that your body couldn't fight off. And nobody understood why. The servant who tastes your food is basically a sentinel for death. If they're still alive an hour after eating your meal, you're probably safe. If they start convulsing or vomiting, you don't eat. You watch them die while you remain hungry and terrified, wondering if someone had tried to kill you today, and you'll never know who did it or why. The mystery is sometimes more terrifying than the actual poison. And then comes the time of the month that transforms you into something that medieval society regards with a mixture of horror and fascination. Your period arrives, and suddenly you're restricted in ways that feel almost religious in their intensity. Because to medieval medicine and theology, menstruation was seen as a form of uncleanness, not metaphorical uncleanness, but actual spiritual and physical corruption. You're bleeding, which means you're weak, which means you're vulnerable to illness, which you need to be confined and protected. That's the reasoning, anyway. The reality is more complicated and significantly more oppressive. During your menstrual period, you're supposed to stay in your chambers. You don't attend church. Your presence would be blasphemous. You don't touch food that will be eaten by men. Your corruption might taint it. You don't sleep with your husband. Contact with him during this time could make him ill or, if you're still fertile, damage any potential pregnancies. You don't engage in strenuous activity. You barely leave your bed. You're essentially quarantined for the duration of your bleeding, treated like you're contagious, which is exactly how medieval people saw menstruation, as a contagious form of illness. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals how deeply this bias was embedded in medieval culture. Physicians genuinely believed that menstrual blood was toxic. Some believed it could cause crops to fail if a menstruating woman walked through a field. Some believed it could turn wine sour or cause milk to curdle. Some believed it could dull metal if touched by a menstruating woman's hands. These weren't fringe beliefs. These were taught in medical schools and genuinely believed by educated people. The entire system was built on the idea that menstruation made you dangerous. The practical reality of your confinement is miserable. You're bleeding, you're probably cramping, and you have no way to manage either of these conditions effectively. Medieval medicine had no concept of feminine hygiene products as we know them. You might use strips of linen or wool, which would be washed and reused. You'd change them frequently to avoid completely saturating them, and you'd have to do the changing yourself or with a trusted lady in waiting. If you bled through, which you absolutely would sometimes, it would be a source of deep shame. There's a quirky historical detail that reveals the era's conflicted attitude toward menstruation despite the horror and revulsion. Menstrual blood was sometimes used in medicines. Physicians would prescribe concoctions containing moon blood, the medicinal term for menstrual blood. as treatments for various ailments. So menstrual blood was simultaneously so disgusting and corrupting that you had to be confined, yet valuable enough to be used as medicine. The cognitive dissonance is stunning. Pain during menstruation wasn't treated as a medical problem, it was treated as part of your feminine nature, as punishment for the sin of Eve, as something you had to endure without complaint. If your cramps were severe enough to limit your movement beyond what confinement already required, you'd still be expected to suffer silently. Complaining would be seen as weakness. Medieval physicians might prescribe bloodletting, which would worsen your condition, or herbal remedies of dubious efficacy. The answer was never, maybe rest and accept the pain. The answer was always some kind of active intervention, usually harmful. Some medieval women were actually grateful for menstruation because it meant they couldn't get pregnant for a few days. In a culture where pregnancy and childbirth were constant threats, where you could easily die or be permanently damaged by another pregnancy, menstruation provided a brief respite. But that respite came at the cost of confinement, shame, and the constant reminder that your body was something shameful and dangerous. The really dark part is this: if you missed your period, everyone knew. There was no privacy. Your fertility was public knowledge. If you skipped a month, a court would begin speculating about whether you were pregnant, whether you were ill, whether something was wrong with you. If you skipped multiple months, physicians would be called in to investigate. Your menstrual cycle was literally community property, tracked and discussed like a weather forecast. The only time you were allowed privacy regarding your body was when you were actively menstruating, and that privacy was enforced confinement. While you're managing your body's betrayals, there's a subtler war being fought in the corridors and chambers of your castle. It's a war fought with words, silences, strategic alliances, and the occasional poisoned wine, the war of court politics, and you're simultaneously a player and a pawn. Your mother-in-law, if she's still alive, is probably watching you with an intensity that borders on predatory. She's protecting her son's interests, which sometimes means protecting him from you. If you've produced in here, she's possibly more interested in that child than she is in your well-being. If you haven't produced in here yet, she's waiting for any sign of weakness, any sign that you might be infertile, or diseased, or unworthy of her son's continued affection. Then there are the other wives. If your husband has decided to take additional wives or concubines, medieval and early modern nobility sometimes practiced polygamy or maintained official mistresses with the tacit approval of the legal wife. You'd know about them. You'd see them at court. You'd know that your husband was sleeping with them. And you'd have to smile and pretend it didn't bother you, because complaining would be seen as jealousy, which is an unbecoming emotion for a noblewoman. You're supposed to be above such petty feelings. You're supposed to understand that your husband's sexual interests are his own business. Meanwhile, you're dying inside, and everyone knows it, and everyone is pretending not to know it. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely unsettling. Some medieval wives actually encouraged their husbands to take mistresses because it was safer than being pregnant constantly. A pregnant wife is a wife who's confined, who's sick, who's available for sexual relations. A husband with a mistress is a husband whose sexual needs are being met elsewhere, which theoretically gives the wife a break. Some women actively sought out concubines for their husbands as a way of reducing the burden on their own bodies. It's a horrifying choice, but it's a choice that made sense within the constraints of medieval life. If you have rival wives or concubines, the politics become even more vicious. You're competing for your husband's attention, for access to his wealth, for the legitimacy and security of your children. A husband might favor a younger concubine, which threatens your position. If he decides he's tired of you, if he decides he wants to marry someone else, you could be cast aside. Return to your father's household in disgrace, or worse, confined to a convent for the rest of your life. Your children might be taken from you. Your reputation might be destroyed. Everything you built, everything you survived, it could all be stripped away because your husband decided he preferred someone else. There's a quirky detail about medieval court politics that reveals how pervasive the danger was. Some noblewomen formed intense same-sex partnerships with other women at court. These relationships, sometimes called romantic friendships, by historians trying to be tasteful, were so open that they were almost public. Two women would be inseparable, sleeping in the same bed, spending all their time together, exchanging love tokens. Medieval society seemed to accept these relationships in a way that would later become absolutely unacceptable. Were they sexual? We don't know. They might have been, or they might have been passionate but not sexual, or they might have been a strategic alliance between women who supported each other against the men in their lives. Whatever they were relationships that provided comfort and alliance in an otherwise hostile environment. The really dangerous women at court are the ones who understand the game. If you're smart, if you're ruthless, if you're willing to navigate the intricate web of alliances and betrayals, you can accumulate significant power. You can influence which children marry whom. You can control access to your husband or your son. You can shift the balance of power through careful maneuvering. But this kind of power requires absolute clarity about what you're doing and absolute willingness to hurt people. Sometimes your own family. Not all women are capable of or interested in playing this game. And then there are the women who simply don't survive it. The ones who make a wrong move, or whose husbands decide they're no longer useful, or who get caught in the crossfire between rival factions. They disappear from history, or they're remembered only in passing. A woman who died mysteriously, a woman who was put aside, a woman who went mad. The casualty rate in medieval court politics, particularly for women, was remarkably high. Every week, you're supposed to confess your sins to the castle chaplain. You kneel in a small confessional, a box barely large enough for 2 people, with a screen between you and the priest, and you tell him about your thoughts, your actions, your failures. The confessional is supposed to be a space of absolute privacy, sealed by the sanctity of the sacrament. What you say there is supposed to stay there, but everyone knows that's not entirely true. The chaplain reports directly to your husband or your father-in-law. He's a spy dressed in religious vestments, and you know it, and he probably knows that you know it. And so you confess strategically. You confess to minor sins. Impatience, unkind thoughts about a servant, failure to pray with sufficient devotion. You don't confess to the things that really trouble you. You don't confess to hating your husband, or resenting your pregnancies, or fantasizing about escape. You don't confess to the times you've considered poisoning him, or the moments when you felt so hopeless that you've considered throwing yourself from a tower. You certainly don't confess to any physical relationships outside your marriage, because that could be reported and could result in your execution. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals the intimate connection between religion and controlled medieval women were taught that their bodies were inherently sinful. Menstruation was a sin you were born into. Sexual desire was a sin. Even within marriage, wanting sex was considered sinful for women. Vanity about your appearance was a sin, but failing to maintain your appearance was also a sin because you'd be neglecting your duty to represent your family's status. Anger was sinful. Sadness was sinful because it implied lack of faith in God's plan. Ambition was sinful. Basically, any emotion or desire that came naturally to you as a human being was categorized as a sin that required confession and penance. The penance assigned for these sins is usually something that adds another layer of suffering to our already suffering life. You might be told to fast on certain days, depriving yourself of food. You might be told to wear a hair shirt, rough, scratchy cloth worn directly against your skin that causes constant irritation and sometimes infection. You might be told to kneel on hard stone for hours. You might be told to sleep on the floor instead of in your comfortable bed. The penance is designed to inflict enough suffering that you'll be motivated to avoid the sin in the future. There's a quirky detail about medieval confession that's genuinely interesting. The confessional, as a physical space, was a medieval invention, developed partly to prevent priests from engaging in inappropriate behavior with female penitents. Before the confessional existed, women confessed directly to priests, sometimes in private, and there were repeated scandals of priests taking sexual advantage of women during confession. So the confessional, with its screen and limited space, was actually a safety measure, a way of reducing priests on penitent sexual assault. The fact that this was necessary is a damning commentary on the era. But the confessional also created a new kind of vulnerability. You're trapped in a small space with a man who knows your deepest secrets, your greatest fears, your hidden shames. He has enormous power over you because he can encourage you toward penance that damages you. He can refuse to absolve you of sin if you don't comply with his spiritual direction. and he can report your confessions to your husband or father-in-law if he decides they're threatening to the political order. Historians still argue about how many priests actually took advantage of the confessional system to control or manipulate women. But what we know is the system was set up in a way that made abuse possible and relatively consequence-free. A priest who manipulated his female penitents could cause enormous damage, psychological, spiritual, sometimes physical, and face little punishment because his authority as a religious figure was essentially unquestionable. Some women found genuine comfort in confession and in their relationship with their chaplain. Some priests were kind, compassionate men who actually wanted to help their female parishioners navigate the impossible demands placed on them. But others used the confessional as a tool of control, and there was no real protection for the women involved. You had to trust your chaplain implicitly because your spiritual salvation supposedly depended on it. But literacy, reading and writing, could be your secret rebellion. If you learned to read, you could access ideas that weren't filtered through the chaplain or your husband or your father. You could read books that made you think, that challenged the assumptions you'd been taught, that showed you other ways of living. Books were valuable, sometimes literally worth more than land. A hand-copied manuscript could take years to produce and could cost a fortune. So if you had access to books, it was a sign of immense wealth and status. But it was also a sign of something else. A sign that your family trusted your intellect, or at least thought you were worth educating. Not all medieval princesses were literate. Some received minimal education, learning just enough to supervise household accounts or read prayers aloud. But some, particularly those born into particularly wealthy or intellectually ambitious families, received real education. They learned Latin, French, possibly Italian or Spanish. They read histories, poetry, devotional texts, and sometimes medical treatises. Some learned to write, which was rarer than reading because writing was considered a more masculine skill. A woman who could read was educated. A woman who could both read and write was dangerously educated, and some families actively discouraged it. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely inspiring. Some medieval women became scholars. Eleanor of Aquitaine sponsored the troubadours and shaped courtly literature. Christine de Pizan was a professional writer who supported herself and her family through her writing. Hildegard of Bingen was a nun, writer, composer, and mystic who corresponded with popes and kings. These women didn't just read, they created, they thought, they participated in intellectual culture. They were exceptions, absolutely, but they proved that it was possible. There's a quirky detail about medieval literacy that reveals the Errol's strange relationship with knowledge. Many noblemen were actually illiterate. They had scribes who wrote and read for them. Being illiterate wasn't shameful for a man. It was normal. A warrior knight didn't need to read, he needed to fight. But a woman was supposed to be educated enough to supervise her household, but not educated enough to threaten her husband's authority. The balance was precarious. You needed to be smart enough to be useful, but not so smart that you became difficult to control. If you could read, you'd probably read devotional texts, lives of saints, biblical commentaries, books about virtue and proper feminine behavior. These were the books most readily available to women and most approved by religious authorities. But sometimes you get access to something else. A book of poetry, perhaps, that contained ideas about love and passion that weren't strictly aligned with official Catholic doctrine. A history that presented events from a different perspective than you'd been taught. A medical treatise that explained how women's bodies actually worked, rather than the humoral theory nonsense you'd been told by physicians. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval women used literacy as a form of resistance or self-expression. But what we know is this: women who could read had access to ideas that other women didn't have. They had the ability to think through problems, to access information, to imagine possibilities beyond their immediate circumstances. It wasn't freedom, not by modern standards, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall of control that surrounded you. And some women used their literacy to communicate in ways that couldn't be easily monitored. They'd write letters to friends, to family members, to people they'd never met. Letter writing was one of the few acceptable forms of female intellectual expression. A woman could write letters, could express her thoughts through writing, could maintain intellectual relationships across distance. Some of the most interesting surviving sources from the medieval period are letters written by women, revealing their wit, their political acumen, their fear, their love, their frustration with the constraints of their lives. Reading was dangerous, though, because books could carry ideas that challenged the existing order. A woman who read too much, who thought too much, who started questioning the assumptions she'd been taught. That woman could become difficult to manage. That woman might refuse to accept her lot. That woman might even try to escape. Your needlework is meditation, rebellion, and art all woven together in thread and cloth. Every day, you sit with your ladies in waiting, sometimes for hours, working on embroidery. Tapestries that will take months or years to complete. Altar cloths for the castle chapel. Robes embroidered with gold thread for court occasions. Bed hangings decorated with intricate patterns. On the surface, this is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Staying occupied, creating beauty, demonstrating your skill and your patience. But needlework is also a space where you can think, where you can let your mind wander, where you can have a kind of privacy even in a room full of people. The physical act of needlework is meditative. Your hands know what they're doing. Pushing the needle through cloth, pulling the thread tight, creating stitches that are perfectly consistent, perfectly even. It's rhythmic, almost hypnotic. While you're doing this repetitive work, your mind can go somewhere else. You can think about things that would be dangerous to say aloud. You can compose letters in your head, arguments you'd like to make but never will, fantasies about freedom. No grains. No one knows what you're thinking while you're stitching because your face is focused on the work, and the work appears to be exactly what appears to be. Feminine accomplishment, nothing more. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely fascinating. Medieval embroidery sometimes contained hidden messages, symbols that had meaning to people who knew how to read them. A particular flower might represent a specific emotion or idea. Certain colors or combinations of colors might encode information. A princess might create a tapestry that looks like a beautiful, innocent depiction of a hunt scene, but actually contains coded messages about her political allegiances, her religious doubts, her secret thoughts. The embroidery was visible to everyone, but the message was only visible to people who knew how to read it. It was perfect camouflage for dangerous thoughts. There's a quirky detail about medieval needlework that reveals how gendered labor was valued. Embroidery was considered women's work, and was therefore valued much less than other forms of artistic creation. A male artist who created a painting or a sculpture was a celebrated artist. A female artisan who created intricate embroidery that took months or years of skilled work was just doing what women were supposed to do. The skill, the creativity, the hours of labor, none of it mattered because it was female work. Yet some of the most beautiful and technically accomplished art of the medieval period was created by women sitting quietly with their needles, doing what everyone assumed was just feminine busywork. Needlework also served a practical purpose that was genuinely dangerous. It could hide weapons, messages, or other contraband. A woman could sew a knife into the hem of her robe. She could hide a letter in the lining of a tapestry. She could create what looked like innocent embroidered designs, but actually contained information that needed to be smuggled somewhere. The needlework that everyone saw as harmless feminine accomplishment was sometimes actually a woman's way of taking agency, of communicating across distances, of resisting the control placed on her. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice actually was, but what we know is this: women had fewer ways to communicate than men did. They couldn't publicly make speeches or participate in official discussions, but they could create things. They could create tapestries, embroidered robes, decorated altar clothes, all of which moved through the world and could carry messages to people who needed to receive them. Needlework was one of the few forms of creative expression that was allowed to women, and some women took full advantage of that allowance. And sometimes, needlework was just needlework, a way to occupy your hands and your time, a way to stay busy so you didn't have to think too hard about your circumstances, a way to create something beautiful in a world that often felt ugly and limiting. Your needlework might be seen by thousands of people, displayed in the castle, given as gifts, used in the church. In a life where your body and voice and your choices all belong to someone else, your needlework might be the only thing that was truly yours. It was signed with your hands, marked with your skill, carrying the imprint of your mind in every stitch. Sometimes you leave the castle. Your husband decides to tour his lands, or your father summons you home for a visit, or you're needed to attend a great gathering at the royal court. These journeys are both a relief and a nightmare. You're escaping the confined world of the castle, but you're also traveling through medieval roads that are basically barely maintained mud tracks. You'll ride for hours on horseback, side saddle, because that's the only appropriate way for a noblewoman to ride, even though it's desperately uncomfortable and potentially dangerous if your horse stumbles. Your retinue will be enormous. Ladies in waiting, servants, guards, probably a chaplain. You'll travel with your possessions packed into wagons, your food and drink secured carefully to prevent contamination or spoilage. You'll stop at castles or monasteries along the way, sleeping in other people's beds, eating food prepared by other people's servants. Every stop is an opportunity for information to travel. Rumors about your health, your fertility, your relationship with your husband. Other noble families will be watching you carefully, assessing whether you're still valuable as an ally, still fertile, still capable of being useful to them. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals how complicated medieval travel could beg. Some noble wives traveled with enormous households that included not just servants but sometimes also their children, their ladies-in-waiting's children, extra animals, and supplies for months-long journeys. A princess traveling to visit her father might be accompanied by dozens of people and hundreds of pounds of baggage. The journey that might a peasant a few days on foot would take the princess weeks on horseback, stopping frequently to rest, to allow the animals to recover, to resupply with fresh food. The roads themselves were dangerous. Bandits preyed on travelers, particularly wealthy ones. Your retinue's guards would be watching constantly for threats. You might pass through territories controlled by hostile nobles. You'd be traveling under a flag of truce, but everyone would know that if something happened, you'd be vulnerable. There were wolves, particularly in certain seasons. There were rivers to cross that might be swollen with rain, potentially impassable. There were diseases that spread in traveling parties. Dysentery from contaminated water, fevers from close quarters, lice that hitched rides in clothing and bedding. There's a quirky detail about medieval princess travel that's genuinely absurd. Your clothing and appearance had to be maintained perfectly, even while traveling through mud and dust on horseback for hours. You couldn't appear disheveled or dirty because that would reflect poorly on your family. So you'd arrive at your destination exhausted, probably covered in sweat and dirt, but your ladies would immediately begin the process of cleaning you up, changing your clothes, repainting your face, redoing your hair. You'd have to look perfect for dinner, no matter how terrible the journey had been. The people you encountered on these journeys would be varied. Monks and nuns at monasteries where you stayed, servants and stable hands at every stop, other traveling nobles on their own journeys, pilgrims heading to holy sites, merchants. Sometimes you'd meet other noble women, and there would be opportunities for genuine conversation, for sharing experiences, for connecting with someone who understood what your life was like. These encounters could be meaningful. Some medieval friendships were maintained across years and distances through letters and occasional meetings. Historians still argue about how much freedom noble women had while traveling, but what we know is this travel was both a restriction and a release. You were confined in your castle most of the time, but when you traveled, you had a reason to leave. You saw different places, met different people, experienced a kind of change that broke up the monotony of castle life. But you were always watched, always escorted, always aware that your role was to represent your family's honor and status at every moment. There was no truly private time, no moment where you could relax completely and just be yourself. And the destination mattered enormously. If you were traveling to your father's castle, you might have a few weeks of relative freedom. Returning to a place where you'd grown up, spending time with family members who'd known you before became a wife and mother. If you were traveling to a royal court gathering, you'd be performing constantly, watching for political threats, trying to advance your family's interests through strategic alliances and carefully managed social interactions. Either way, the journey was exhausting, and the destination would present new challenges you'd have to navigate. Your children, if you've been lucky enough to have them survive infancy, are not really yours. This is one of the cruelest aspects of medieval noble life, and it's something nobody really prepares you for emotionally. From the moment your baby is born, especially if it's a boy, they're no longer primarily your responsibility. They're the responsibility of the dynasty. Your sons will be trained by men to be warriors and leaders. Your daughters will be trained by women to be wives and mothers, just like you were. The actual day-to-day care of your children will be handled by wet nurses, maids, tutors, and guards. You'll see your children at set times, perhaps during a meal, perhaps for a few hours in the afternoon, but they won't sleep in your bed. You won't be the one responding to their cries. You won't be the one teaching them their first words or watching them take their first steps with the kind of intense, undivided attention that modern parents expect. Your son, your precious, important son, will be taken from you when he's young, probably around age 7 or 8. He'll be sent away to be fostered by another noble family or to train as a page in a royal household. This is where he'll learn to be a knight, to fight, to ride horses, to understand politics and strategy. He might not return home for years. You'll miss his childhood. You'll miss watching him grow. But this is considered the correct and proper way to raise a noble son. If you kept him close to you, if you allowed yourself to be his primary caregiver, he'd be seen as weak or overly attached to his mother, and that would damage his prospects. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely heartbreaking. Many noble children barely knew their mothers. They knew the servants who raised them. They knew their tutors and trainers. They knew their siblings, but their actual parents were distant figures. Their father was often away at war governing his lands, and their mother was occupied with her own duties as the lady of the castle. The emotional bond between parent and child was often minimal. This wasn't seen as tragic or damaging. It was seen as normal and proper. Your daughters would stay with you longer, but they too would eventually be taken from you, married off to other families, sent to convents, or claimed by their father's family for their own purposes. If your daughter was betrothed as a child, she might be sent to her future husband's household to be raised by his family, learning his family's customs and expectations. She might not see you for years. You'd be left wondering how she was being treated, whether she was happy, whether she'd been hurt or abused, and you'd have no real recourse if something went wrong because she was no longer under your protection. She belonged to her husband's family now. There's a quirky detail about medieval parenthood that's absolutely fascinating. Some noble families seem to care deeply for their children, and we know this from personal letters and documents that reveal genuine affection and concern. But other families seemed remarkably indifferent. A child's death, even a beloved child, might be mentioned in passing in a letter with no particular emotional weight. A child might be bartered away in a political deal without any apparent consideration for their feelings or preferences. The relationship between parent and child varied enormously, and we honestly don't fully understand what drove those differences. Historians still argue about how much love existed in medieval parent-child relationships and whether the distance between parent and child was emotionally damaging or simply normal for the era. But what we know is this: the medieval approach to childhood and parenting was radically different from modern approaches. You might love your children desperately, but you wouldn't necessarily spend much time with them or make decisions based on their emotional well-being. Your love for them was compatible with sending them away, with allowing them to be treated harshly, with using them as bargaining chips in political negotiations. If a child died, and many did, your grief would be real but often muted. You might mourn, but you'd also accept it as God's will. Medieval infant and child mortality was so high that people didn't necessarily name their children until they were several years old, and had demonstrated that they were likely to survive. The death of a child, while painful, was almost expected. You'd grieve, recover, and hopefully produce another child to replace the one you'd lost. The idea of giving each child an irreplaceable place in your heart and your life, that's a modern concept, not a medieval one. But sometimes a child dies anyway, despite all your care and the care of the physicians and the prayers and the herbal remedies and the desperate hope that this time, this one child, will survive to adulthood. Medieval medicine has no antibiotics, no vaccines, no way to treat infections or manage complications. A simple childhood illness, the measles, the smallpox, even just a fever, could be fatal. A child could wake up healthy and be dead by nightfall. A child could seem to be recovering and then suddenly take a turn for the worse. and there's nothing anyone can do except pray and watch and wait for the inevitable. The grief of losing a child is profound, even in a culture that normalizes child death. You've carried this child in your body. You've felt them move and kick. You've given birth to them in agony and fear. You've seen them take their first breath, heard them cry, held them in your arms. Even if someone else has been their primary caregiver, even if you've barely seen them, there's a connection there that's bone deep. And then they're gone, and you have to keep living, have to keep functioning, have to keep fulfilling your duties as though your heart hasn't been ripped out of your chest. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals the brutality of medieval medicine. Sometimes physicians' treatments actually killed children. A fever that might have broken on its own, if left alone, could be treated by bloodletting until the child was so weakened they couldn't recover. An infection that might have been managed by keeping the wound clean could be treated by applying poultices that introduced more bacteria. Physicians were trying to help, presumably, but they were working with almost no understanding of actual medicine. They were following theories that were fundamentally wrong. If the child was old enough to have already been betrothed or married off, the death was complicated by politics. A child bride who died before consummation might have their death contested politically, had the marriage been valid. Was the bride's family required to return the dowry? Would the alliance between families hold? Your personal grief had to be compartmentalized while you dealt with the political implications of the death. You'd be mourning while simultaneously negotiating terms with your in-law's family. There's a quirky detail about medieval child death that's surprisingly moving. Some families seem to mark their children's deaths with surprising emotional intensity. Tombs were erected. Masses were said regularly for the child's soul. Letters expressed genuine devastation at the loss, but other families seemed to barely acknowledge the death. The child was replaced with another as quickly as possible, and life moved forward. We don't fully understand why some families grieved publicly and extensively, while others seemed to absorb the loss more quietly. It might have to do with the child's age, their importance to the dynasty, the parents' temperament, or factors we can't determine from historical records. Historians still argue about how the high rates of child mortality shaped medieval psychology and parenting practices. But what we know is this: living in a world where children died constantly would have changed how people approached parenthood. You might protect yourself emotionally by maintaining distance from your children. You might accept their deaths as inevitable while still grieving them. You might have multiple children in rapid succession because you expected someone to die and needed to ensure that at least one survived to adulthood. You might try desperately to save each child while simultaneously preparing yourself for their possible death. The death of a child was also a spiritual crisis. Why would God take your child? What sin had you committed that warranted this punishment? Medieval theology had explanations. The child was being taken to heaven, saved from a sinful world, called by God for purposes beyond human understanding. These explanations might be comforting, or they might feel hollow when you're holding your dead child. Either way, you'd have to accept the death and keep moving forward, because staying trapped in your grief wasn't acceptable. You had duties. You had other children, possibly, who needed you. You had a household to manage. You had a husband who expected you to be available to him. Your personal devastation had to be put aside in service to the needs of others. In the darkness of your bedchamber, sometimes you wonder what it would be like to love someone who wasn't assigned to you by a political treaty. Someone you chose. Someone who chose you. Someone whose presence didn't fill you with dread or resentment or anxiety about what you might do wrong next. And perhaps, if you're very unlucky, you meet someone who makes you wonder that out loud instead of just in your head. Medieval princesses and noblewomen did sometimes have affairs. It's not something that's talked about much in history. The narratives tend to focus on official marriages and dynastic concerns. But the evidence is there if you know where to look. A lady in waiting who becomes pregnant and has to be quietly married off to a distant nobleman. A noblewoman who disappears from court for a few months, supposedly visiting her sick father, and returns looking devastated. Letters that are suspiciously romantic for documents that are supposed to be purely business. The scandal doesn't always make it into the historical record, but it happened often enough that everyone knew it was a risk. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely fascinating. Some medieval affairs were surprisingly open. A woman might have a lover that everyone at court knew about, including her husband, and nothing would be done about it unless the affair resulted in a pregnancy or a major scandal. If she was discreet, if she didn't flaunt the affair, if she continued to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother and manager of the household, she might be tacitly allowed to continue. The affair existed in a gray space, officially unacknowledged but practically tolerated. This was more likely if the woman was past childbearing age or if she'd already produced the required heirs and her fertility was no longer crucial. There's a quirky detail about medieval affairs that reveals the era's strange morality. A woman having an affair was considered far more scandalous than a man having one. A man's infidelity was seen as natural, almost inevitable. A woman's infidelity was seen as a betrayal of her marriage, a threat to the legitimacy of her children, a moral failing of catastrophic proportions. A man might be forgiven for keeping a mistress. A woman would be ruined if discovered. The double standard was absolute and unquestioned. If you had an affair and were discovered, the consequences could be severe. You might be confined to a convent for the rest of your life. Your children could be taken from you. Your reputation would be destroyed, which didn't just affect you personally. It would affect your entire family's honor and standing. Your father might be shamed. Your brothers might face difficulty finding good marriages for their own daughters. An affair wasn't just a personal choice, it was a threat to your entire family's position. And yet some women did it anyway. Some women took the risk of loving someone who wasn't their husband, of having a relationship based on actual choice rather than duty. The reasons varied. Maybe the husband was brutal or indifferent, and the affair represented the only love the woman had ever experienced. Maybe the lover was someone the woman had known before her marriage, and rekindling that relationship felt like a lifeline to her former self. Maybe the affair was purely physical, a way of experiencing pleasure and agency in a body that was usually under someone else's control. Maybe it was a way of asserting power in a situation where the woman had almost no power. Or maybe it was just loneliness, and the lover was someone who made the unbearable burden of existence slightly more bearable. Historians still argue about how common medieval affairs were and what they meant for medieval marriage and sexuality. But what we know is this: women had desires and agency even in a system designed to deny them both. Some women chose to act on those desires despite the enormous risks. Some women found moments of freedom or pleasure or genuine connection in relationships that existed outside the framework of marriage and duty. Not all women took this risk. Many never did either, because they didn't want to or because the risks were too great. But the fact that some women did suggests that medieval women, despite the constraints placed on them, never entirely accepted those constraints. Somewhere, underneath the layers of obedience and duty, there was still a person who wanted something more. And then your husband dies. He might be killed in battle, struck down by illness, or simply worn out by age and the constant demands of ruling. You've spent decades with this man, decades of sharing a bed, producing children, managing a household around him, organizing your life around his needs and whims. And then suddenly he's gone, and you're a widow. For the first time in your adult life. You're not someone's daughter or someone's wife. You're your own person, legally. And that's both a liberation and a catastrophe. Widowhood was complicated for medieval noblewomen. On one hand, you now had rights you didn't have before. You could potentially manage your own estates. You could refuse to remarry if you had the resources to support yourself. You could make some of your own decisions. On the other hand, you'd probably lost your primary source of income, your status, and your security. Your children would likely be taken from your guardianship and put under the control of their father's family or the king. You'd lose access to your husband's wealth. You might be pressured to remarry by your own family or his family because a widow was seen as a burden, a person without a man to protect her and control her. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals the precarious position of medieval widows. So many widows were wealthy and independent, living on the lands their husbands left them, managing estates, making their own decisions. But others were left with almost nothing and had to depend on the charity of their children or their own families. A widow's wealth depended enormously on what her husband left her. Some husbands left detailed instructions ensuring their wives would be well cared for. Others left their wives with just enough to survive. And some left their widows practically destitute. There's a quirky detail about medieval widows that's genuinely interesting. Some widows used their newfound independence to engage in business, to become patrons of the arts, to pursue intellectual interests they'd never had time for before. A widow might commission books, support artists and scholars, or even take up religious study. Without a husband demanding her time and attention, a widow could pursue activities that were simply impossible for married women. Some widows seemed to flourish in widowhood, finally free from the constraints that had defined their entire married lives. But widowhood could also be lonely. You'd spent your entire life defined by your relationship to a man, and suddenly that man was gone. Your entire identity, wife, lady of the castle, keeper of your husband's household, was suddenly obsolete. You had to figure out who you were as a person independent of those roles. For some women, this was a process of discovery and liberation. For others, it was a process of loss and disorientation. You'd spent so long trying to be what you were supposed to be that you didn't know how to be anything else. If you had the resources and the desire to remain unmarried, you could do so, but you'd face constant pressure to remarry. Your family would want you married for your own protection and for potential political advantage. Suitors would appear, hoping to marry a wealthy widow and gain access to her lands and income. You'd have to navigate these proposals carefully, deciding whether remarriage would provide security or whether it would trap you in another situation you couldn't escape. Historians still argue about motivated some widows to remarry and others to remain single, but what we know is this widowhood was a crossroads. You could continue the life you'd been living, just without a husband. You could remarry and potentially trade one set of constraints for another. You could enter a convent and exchange marriage for religious life. You could use your newfound independence to pursue activities that had been closed to you as a wife. Not all widows had all these options. It depended on wealth, family support, and personal circumstances. But the fact that widows had options that married women didn't have suggests that even within the constraints of medieval society, there were moments when women could genuinely exercise choice about their own futures. Some widows became powerful political figures. They ruled kingdoms in their sons' names until those sons came of age. They influenced the policies of their deceased husbands' successors. They became formidable forces in court politics. A widow, no longer bound by need to please a husband, could be ruthless in pursuing her own interests and her children's interests. Some of the most effective political operators in medieval Europe were widows who'd learned to navigate the power dynamics of court life and had finally been freed from the primary constraint that had limited them their entire lives: the requirement to defer to a man's authority. Some women never gave up their power to a husband in the first place. They ruled from behind the throne, pulling strings, making decisions, shaping policy while their husbands or sons got the credit and the glory. These women understood medieval politics in ways that most men never would because they'd had to learn to operate in the shadows, to accumulate power quietly, to know when to push and when to retreat. A wife who was intelligent and ambitious could become the true power in a kingdom while her husband believed he was making all the decisions. A mother could shape her son's reign through the force of her personality and her political acumen. A regent could hold power in her own right, ruling for a young king until he came of age. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just marry kings and princes. She shaped European politics for decades. She ruled her own lands in her own right. She supported her sons in rebellion against their father. She was imprisoned for years for her political activities and released to rule again. She was one of the most powerful people in medieval Europe, and she got there by being smarter, more ruthless, and more determined than the men around her. She's exceptional, absolutely, but she proves what was possible for women who had enough wealth, enough family support, and enough willingness to fight for power. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals how real the power of consort queens could beg. Some medieval queens were described in contemporary documents as being more influential in government than their husbands. A queen could influence appointments, policy decisions, military strategy, and succession. A queen could refuse her husband's requests and face no real consequences. A queen could accumulate wealth independent of her husband's resources. Some queens had their own households, their own servants, their own sources of income. They weren't just decorative additions to their husbands' courts. They were operators in their own right. There's a quirky detail about medieval female power that reveals how creative women had to be to operate in a male-dominated system. Some of the most powerful women in medieval Europe operated through what modern people might call soft power. They didn't rule publicly. They influenced through persuasion, through personal relationships, through knowing what men wanted and being willing to provide it in exchange for policy concessions. A woman might have enormous influence over military decisions because her husband valued her counsel. A woman might shape her kingdom's religious policy because she had a close relationship with the archbishop. The power operated through networks of relationship and influence rather than through official channels. But it was no less real. A medieval woman with power had to maintain a careful balance. She couldn't be seen as dominating her husband or her son because that would undermine his authority and potentially damage his political standing. But she could be seen as advising, guiding, suggesting. She could frame her wishes as serving his interests. She could make it clear that when she recommended something, it was because she thought deeply about how to best serve the kingdom and his reign. Some husbands actively valued their wives' counsel and were willing to admit it. Others pretended to make their own decisions while actually just implementing their wives' ideas. Either way, the power existed. Historians still argue about how much actual influence medieval consort queens had versus how much was attributed to them by chroniclers with their own agendas. But what we know is this: women could accumulate significant power within the constraints of medieval monarchy. Not all women did. Many didn't have the opportunity, the talent, the ruthlessness, or the support necessary to acquire real power. But some women, particularly those born into powerful families, those married to weak or young men, those intelligent and ambitious enough to recognize opportunities and exploit them, these women could become major political forces. The key was understanding that power didn't always have to be public or official. You could rule from your chambers, through letters and private conversations. You could shape policy by choosing what information your husband received and how it was presented to him. You could build networks of loyal followers who would work on your behalf. You could use your children as extensions of your power, positioning them in key positions and steering them toward advantageous marriages, ensuring they'd support your interests after you'd lost the power that came from being consort. For a woman with ambition, intelligence, and access to power, medieval politics offered opportunities that might seem surprising given how much control was theoretically exercised over women. The constraints were real and crushing for most women. But for the exceptional few who understood how to navigate them, who were willing to be ruthless, who had support from family and allies, for these women, medieval politics could be a stage on which to accumulate real power and leave a genuine mark on history. But not every woman wanted to play the political game. Not every woman was interested in ruling from behind the throne or accumulating power through strategic marriages and manipulation. Some women looked at the options available to them, marriage and all its horrors, or something else entirely, and chose something else. They chose the convent. A convent wasn't an escape exactly, because life in a convent had its own constraints and difficulties. You'd still answer to an authority figure, your abbess instead of your husband. You'd still be subject to rules about what you could eat, when you could sleep, what you could think about. You'd still be monitored and controlled, but it was a different kind of control, and for some women, it was preferable. In a convent, you wouldn't be pregnant constantly. You wouldn't be used as a sexual object. You wouldn't be forced to bear children that you couldn't care for. You'd be part of a community of women who understood what you were experiencing because they were experiencing it too. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals how complicated the relationship was between women and religious life. Many convents were genuinely spiritual communities where women could study, write, create, and exercise leadership. A woman could become an abbess and actually have authority over her community. She could make decisions, manage resources, and exercise real power within her sphere. Some convents had schools where girls, and sometimes even boys, were educated. Some convents had scriptoriums where manuscripts were copied, creating books that would survive centuries. Some convents were centers of intellectual life, where women engaged with theology, philosophy, and science. But convents were also dumping grounds for inconvenient women. A daughter who wouldn't consent to an arranged marriage might be placed in a convent against her will. A woman whose husband wanted to remarry without the inconvenience of a divorce could get a papal annulment and place his former wife in a convent. A woman who'd scandalized her family through an affair or an illegitimate pregnancy could be placed in a convent as penance. Some women entered convents happily, called to religious life and eager to serve God. Others were placed there unwillingly, their agency stripped away once again, just in a different setting. There's a quirky detail about medieval convent life that reveals its complexity. Many convents were run by noble women from prominent families, and these abbesses wielded significant power. An abbess might have more actual authority than some bishops. An abbess might correspond with popes and kings. An abbess might own significant property and command resources. For a woman from a powerful family, becoming an abbess could mean accumulating more real power than she would have if she'd married a minor noble. But for a woman without such connections, a convent life meant poverty and servitude to more powerful abbesses. Some medieval women used convent life as a way to maintain their independence and their intellectual pursuits. Hildegard of Bingen was a nun who became one of the most important intellectual figures of her era: composer, a writer, a mystic, a healer. She's exceptional, but she's proof that convent life could accommodate exceptional minds and exceptional women. A woman in a convent could study languages, read philosophy, create music and art. She could participate in the intellectual life of her era in ways that married women rarely could. Historians still argue about how many women chose convent life genuinely and how many were forced to it. But what we know is this: convents offered an alternative path for women who didn't want to marry, or who couldn't marry suitable husbands, or who wanted to escape marriage after experiencing it. The convent came with its own constraints and difficulties, but those constraints were different enough that some women preferred them. In a world where women's options were limited and brutal, a convent, even one where you were placed against your will, sometimes looked better than the alternative. For a woman escaping an abusive marriage, a convent could mean safety. For a woman with intellectual ambitions, a convent could mean education and opportunity to use her mind. For a woman who simply didn't want to be married, a convent could mean freedom from that particular fate. The religious vow of chastity was sometimes easier to accept than the sexual servitude of marriage. The poverty of convent life was sometimes preferable to the emotional poverty of being used as a breeding machine by a husband who didn't care about her, and the obedience required in a convent was sometimes preferable to the arbitrary cruelty of a man who had absolute power over her body and her children. Time is relentless, though, and eventually it catches up with you. Your beauty, which has been so carefully maintained and so fiercely policed, begins to fade. Your skin becomes lined, your hair grains. Your body, which has endured pregnancies and childbirth and decades of restriction, begins to fail. Your teeth fall out, or extracted because medieval dentistry is barbaric and extraction is often preferable to living with an infected tooth. Your hair might thin or fall out. Your eyesight might deteriorate. Your joints ache from years of wearing tight clothing and riding side saddle on horses. Your hands, which were once soft and pale and perfectly manicured, become wrinkled and spotted with age, and society stops seeing you. If you're past menopause, your fertility is gone, which means your primary value, your ability to produce heirs, is obsolete. If you're not a widow with money or a noblewoman with power, you become largely irrelevant. You're no longer desirable sexually, so your husband might stop visiting your bedchamber entirely. You're no longer able to produce children, so you're no longer valuable as a wife. If you have daughters, they might be competing with you for attention and resources. Younger women at court might regard you with a mixture of pity and satisfaction, knowing that their turn to age and become invisible is coming but not yet urgent. Here's a mainstream historical fact that's genuinely depressing: medieval beauty standards were incredibly harsh on aging women. Pale skin was valued, so wrinkles were a sign of failure. A smooth complexion was valued, so age spots were marks of deterioration. Youth was valued, so simply getting older was a betrayal of what you'd been trained to be. Some aging noblewomen tried desperately to maintain their appearance, using more cosmetics, employing more servants to help with grooming, wearing clothes that flattered them rather than simply displayed their status. Others seemed to give up, accepting that their time of being beautiful was past and they had to figure out who they were now. There's a quirky detail about medieval women's aging that reveals the era's strange relationship with female worthing. Some women seemed to gain power and respect as they aged, particularly if they had influential sons or daughters. A mother-in-law could wield significant authority in a household. A grandmother could have influence over grandchildren and family decisions. An older woman who'd survived long enough to outlive multiple husbands might have accumulated enough resources and knowledge to be genuinely powerful. Age could bring respect, but only if you had power independent of your beauty and your fertility. But for most women, aging meant becoming invisible. You'd walk through a room and people wouldn't notice you. You'd offer an opinion and it would be overlooked or attributed to someone else. You'd exist in a strange liminal space where you were still expected to fulfill your duties. Managing servants, supervising household tasks, attending court functions, but you were no longer valued or appreciated for doing so. You'd become a monument to what you once were, haunting the spaces where you'd once been powerful and desired. The terror of aging was something that would have been with you throughout your life. Every wrinkle was a warning. Every gray hair was a herald of obsolescence. Every year that passed was a year closer to becoming irrelevant. Some women resisted this fate desperately, clinging to youth through cosmetics and clothing and sheer force of will. Others seemed to accept it more gracefully, finding new sources of meaning and power in their later years. But virtually all women felt the pressure, the dread, the knowledge that their value in medieval society was inextricably linked to youth and their beauty, and that no amount of cosmetics could stop that decline forever. Historians still argue about how much medieval women internalized these beauty standards versus how much they resisted or reshaped them. But what we know is this: aging was a genuine threat to medieval women's security and status. A woman whose beauty faded had to rely on other sources of power: wealth, family connections, political acumen, or the loyalty of children who'd made advantageous marriages. If she had none of these things, aging could reduce her from a valued member of society to a burden, tolerated but not loved, present but not noticed, alive but essentially already dead. But before all that invisibility and decline, while you still have some power left, whether through wealth, through influential children, through accumulated wisdom, or through sheer force of personality, you have the chance to build something that will outlast you. You have the chance to build a legacy. This is one of the few ways a medieval princess could achieve something like immortality, could make sure she was remembered, could ensure that her life mattered beyond the immediate moment. Some women built their legacies through their children. If you'd raised sons who became powerful rulers, if you'd married off daughters to advantageous families who then produced important grandchildren, you could claim credit for dynasties. Your descendants would carry your bloodline forward, and as long as your family remained important, your role in creating that family would be remembered. Some women's entire identity became defined by the success of their children. They were known as the mother of kings, the grandmother of queens. It wasn't individual achievement, but it was something. Other women built legacies through patronage. If you had wealth or access to wealth, through your own inheritance, through your husband's generosity, or through accumulating resources over decades, you could become a patron of the arts. You could commission books, manuscripts, tapestries. You could support artists, musicians, poets. These creations would carry your name, sometimes literally, inscriptions that credited you as the patron, ensuring that you'd be remembered as the person who made the artwork possible. Long after you died, an illuminated manuscript you'd commissioned might still exist, still be beautiful, still bear witness to your existence and your taste. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals how important patronage was to medieval legacy building. Many of the greatest works of medieval art were created at the behest of noble patrons, and many of those patrons were women. A nobleman who was intelligent enough to recognize talent and willing to spend resources to support it could influence the artistic culture of an entire era. The books she commissioned might be read centuries later. The art she supported might influence subsequent artists. The beauty she helped create could outlast her by centuries. Religious patronage was another way to build a legacy. If you had resources, you could endo religious buildings, fund monasteries, or create religious foundations that would bear your name. You could ensure that after your death, masses would be said for your soul every day, that your name would be remembered in prayers, that you'd be remembered not just as a woman, but as a pious woman, a woman who supported God's work. This was partly spiritual, genuinely about trying to ensure your salvation, but it was also profoundly about legacy. You wanted to be remembered. You wanted to matter. There's a quirky detail about medieval legacy that building reveals the era's complicated attitudes toward female power. Some women's legacies were actively written out of history. A noblewoman's influence over her husband or son might be erased from historical records. Her patronage might be credited to the man in her life. Her political acumen might be invisible in formal histories, and yet some women's legacies survive primarily through physical objects, the things they had made, the things they endowed, the things they created or caused to be created. These objects couldn't be erased the way written records could be. Some women tried to ensure their legacy through education of the next generation. If you had daughters or daughters-in-law, you could teach them what you'd learned about navigating power, about managing household resources, about influencing men without appearing to do so. You could pass on knowledge that was essentially forbidden from being written down, knowledge that had to be transmitted orally from woman to woman. Your granddaughter might learn from you how to survive marriage, how to manage a castle, how to accumulate power. She might not remember your name in 50 years, but she'd remember your lessons, and your lessons would flow through her bloodline and her descendants. Historians still argue about how much control medieval women actually had over their own legacies, but what we know is this: women understood that their time of power and influence was limited. You could have a few decades as a valued wife and mother. You might have additional decades as a widow or as an older woman with influence. But eventually you'd fade. Eventually you'd die. The only way to ensure that your existence mattered, that you left something behind, was to create it consciously and deliberately. So women did what they could. They had children, they patronized the arts, they funded religious institutions, they passed on knowledge to the next generation. They tried to write their names into history while they still could, understanding that after they were gone, history would likely forget them anyway. And then, finally, comes the end. Your body, which has been bearing witness to your entire life. Pregnancy after pregnancy, restriction after restriction, illness after illness, finally gives out. Medieval medicine still can't help you. Physicians bleed you, give you useless herbal remedies, pray over you. But nothing works. You're dying, and everyone around you knows it, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. If you're lucky, you die quickly. An infection, a fever that spikes too high, a hemorrhage that can't be stopped. These things can kill you in days. If you're unlucky, you die slowly, lingering for weeks or months, in pain, increasingly helpless, losing control of your body, the way you lost control of it in labor decades ago. You're aware of what's happening. You can hear people around you saying goodbye, saying final prayers, positioning themselves to inherit what you're leaving behind, your will. If you had the power and foresight to create one, will distribute your belongings according to your wishes. You might leave money to religious institutions. You might leave jewelry and clothing to your ladies in waiting. You might leave lands to your children, or instructions about marriages you want arranged, or requests about how you want to be buried and remembered. This is one of the last moments of power you'll have, choosing how your resources will be used after you're gone. Some women used this power to surprise people, to provide for people they cared about, to make final statements about what mattered to them. Here's a mainstream historical fact that reveals how final death was a medieval woman's death marked the end not just of her life, but often of her economic power. A widow's income from her husband's estates would revert to her children or to the crown. A woman's jewelry and fine clothes would be distributed among her heirs. Her household would be disbanded. Her ladies-in-waiting would have to find new positions. Her chambers would be cleared out and reassigned. Within weeks, it would be as though you'd never lived in that castle at all. There's a quirky detail about medieval death that's surprisingly human. Some women seemed to be genuinely mourned after they died. Letters express real sorrow at the loss. Religious services were held regularly for their souls. They were remembered with affection by people who'd known them. But other women seemed to be forgotten almost immediately, their names mentioned only in passing in genealogical records, remembered more as a link in a chain of inheritance than as actual people who'd lived and felt and suffered. Your tomb, if your family had the resources and the inclination to commission one, would be your final statement to posterity. Your effigy would be carved in stone, showing you at your best, youthful and beautiful forever. Inscriptions would record your name, your titles, your marriages. If you'd been important enough, you might be buried in a cathedral or a church, and people would visit your tomb, and your name would be read aloud in prayers for centuries. Your stone face would outlive flesh by hundreds of years. But for most women, death meant oblivion, a grave in a monastery cemetery, a stone with your name on it that would eventually weather and become illegible, a memory that would fade as your children died, and their children died, and their grandchildren didn't know who you were. You'd lived, you'd suffered, you'd endured, and then you'd be gone, and the world would keep turning without you, and eventually there would be no one alive who remembered your name or your face or the sound of your voice. Historians still argue about how much medieval death rituals were designed to comfort the living versus how much they were designed to ensure the dead were properly honored. But what we know is this death was final. There was no resurrection, no second chances, no comeback. You lived the life you were given, and then it was over. You made the best of it, or you didn't. You accumulated power, or you remained powerless. You left a legacy, or you were forgotten. And either way, you died, and your body decomposed, and the earth took back what it had lent. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the life of a medieval princess. As the hours grow late and your eyes grow heavy, let yourself sink deeper into rest, knowing that the woman you've been listening to tonight, with all her struggles, her fears, her quiet rebellions, lived in a world so different from ours that it might as well have been another planet. She was trapped in a gilded cage, yes, but she was also remarkable. She survived childbirth in an era when that survival was far from guaranteed. She navigated impossible political situations with whatever tools she had available. Needlework, literacy, careful words whispered to the right people at the right time. She loved, she grieved, she created beauty even while surrounded by ugliness. She was constrained by forces beyond her control, and yet, within those constraints, some part of her remained defiant, remained alive, remained fully human. Your own life, whatever it is, contains freedoms she could never have imagined. You can choose your own path. You can refuse an unwanted marriage. You can pursue an education for its own sake, rather than to make yourself more valuable to a husband. You can have control over your own body, your own reproduction, your own future. These freedoms were purchased, in a very real sense, by all the women who came before you, who survived, who endured, who found small ways to resist the systems that tried to define and limit them. As you drift towards sleep, carry this knowledge with you. The medieval princess's life, for all its horror and constraint, was also a testament to human resilience. Women found ways to matter. They found ways to love. They found ways to create meaning in lives that were ostensibly meaningless. They refused, at every level, to be entirely what the system wanted them to be. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere in the past, countless women lived lives as complex and full as any life today. Their stories are mostly lost, but the essence of what they were, their strength, their creativity, their refusal to be entirely broken, that essence survives in the women who came after them, and you, listening in the darkness. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind settle. Let the weight of the day fall away from you. Sleep comes gently now, and in sleep, perhaps you'll dream of stone towers and candlelit chambers, of women whose names we'll never know but whose lives changed the shape of history. Sweet dreams and rest well tonight. End of story. Sweet dreams.